Here's a paradox. Women commit far fewer violent crimes than men. Research shows girls often develop empathy and impulse control earlier. Yet modern criminal justice policy increasingly frames women offenders as victims of structural forces. So which is it? Are women developmentally advantaged in key social cognitive areas, or primarily shaped by oppressive conditions requiring special treatment? And if justice is about individual responsibility, should gender even enter the equation? This video dives into one of the most controversial debates in criminal justice today.
Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. As you know, our mission is to humanize the criminal justice system, particularly around wrongful convictions. But at the same time, we have increasingly addressed wider criminal justice policy issues, something many of you have asked us to expand on. In this video, we do just that. So sit back, put on your policy expert hat as we examine the intersection of policy and criminal justice with a particular focus on gender-based policies. So imagine two people commit the same crime, same intent, same damage, same prior record. One is male, one is female. Should the law treat them differently? Not because of what they did, but because of who they are. That's not a hypothetical. In many modern justice systems, policy is increasingly shaped around gender-based group differences, and the UK is not exception. According to an article in the Mirror dated the 14th of February, David Lammy is expected to launch a women's justice strategy next month. More female offenders will be supervised under dedicated women's courts that aim to cut reoffending and improve family relationships. Some call it progress, others call it discrimination dressed up as compassion. Today, we dare to ask an uncomfortable question, one that some, and particularly those responsible for delivering criminal justice, would rather avoid. Is gender criminal justice policy fair, or is it quietly undermining equality? As always, our intention is not to advance a preconceived position, but to present the relevant arguments, enabling you to reach your own conclusion. So we are told that women in prison often report high rates of domestic abuse, sexual victimization, childhood trauma, mental health struggles. Let me anticipate an objection that some of you may already be thinking. You might say, aren't these figures based largely on what women report, rather than on independently verified facts? You may say there is research suggesting that men may experience some of the same problems, but that they are less likely to report them, and this skews the true position. You might say there is also evidence that in some cases women have not been truthful about claims of abuse. For whatever reason, it could be mental health issue as well, not necessarily lying. Okay, I say those are important and complex issues in their own right, but for the purpose of this first part of the discussion, let's set those questions aside. Let's assume, purely as a working premise, that what women are reporting is entirely accurate and accept those reports at face value. Now, those supporting gender-responsive justice say the logic is simple. If women's pathway into crime often involves trauma and coercion, then justice should reflect that context. So this leads to then trauma-informed sentencing, alternative programs for female offenders, rehabilitation tailored specifically to women, recognition of caregiving responsibilities. On the surface, this sounds compassionate, but here is where the discomfort starts. When we consistently describe women offenders as victims of patriarchy, survivors of abuse, traumatized or vulnerable, shaped by structural oppression, what are we exactly implying? Are we saying women have less agency? Are we subtly lowering expectation of responsibility? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Justice is built on the idea that adults are moral agents. If you commit a crime, you chose to do it. If we start explaining criminal behavior primarily through structural narratives, at what point does accountability erode? Also, the flip side is we know the men commit the overwhelming majority of violent crimes. So should we design male-specific, harsher deterrence programs? Why is it group-based policy acceptable in one direction but controversial in the other? Now, let's introduce something fascinating at this point. Research has long shown that certain individual and environmental factors are linked to a higher risk of offending. On the individual level, traits such as high impulsivity, lower cognitive ability, and poor academic achievement are often associated with increased criminal or violent behavior. Family background also matters, that is an environmental factor. Limited parental supervision, inconsistent discipline, or growing up with a parent who has criminal history can increase risks. And peer influence plays a role as well. Associating closely with delinquent peers is one of the strongest predictors of youth offending. These factors are widely accepted in criminological research. But at the same time, researchers have also tried to explain why statistically females tend to offend at lower rates than males. One explanation focuses on social and cognitive development. Studies suggest that girls, on average, develop certain social cognitive skills earlier than boys. This includes the ability to read social cues, regulate emotions, and anticipate consequences. Females are also found to display stronger pro-social skills, such as empathy, communication, and conflict resolution, which can act as protective factors against antisocial behavior. Researchers argue that these differences may be shaped by a combination of biological and social influences. Some studies point to neurological development patterns, including differences in brain connectivity and fewer frontal lobe deficits. Others highlight stronger verbal abilities and different socialization process, with parents and peers often encouraging relational awareness and emotional expression in girls more than in boys. Together, these factors are offered as possible explanation for why offending rates differ between males and females on average. while recognizing, of course, that individuals within each group vary widely. So, developmental research shows, in brief, that on average, girls develop certain social cognitive skills earlier than boys. Girls show earlier impulsive regulation. Girls often score higher in early empathy measures. Boys show higher impulsivity and externalizing behaviors during adolescence. So here is the tension. On one hand, women are described in policy as structurally disadvantaged and psychologically burdened. On the other hand, research suggests developmental advantages in social cognition and regulation. If cognitive skills play a role in shaping criminal behavior, then this raises an important question. If that developmental advantage exists, what does it mean for how we think about responsibility? And should the criminal justice system take those differences into account? And if so, how? Would earlier development of social cognitive skills suggest greater capacity for self-regulation and therefore greater agency and responsibility? Or should such differences be treated as general trends that have little relevance to individual cases? In other words, if we accept that cognitive development influences behavior, we must also ask how and if at all those developmental differences should matter when questions of accountability and justice arise. So, which narrative is more accurate? Or are we selectively choosing narratives that justify policy? So this is where the conversation gets heated. Some argue equality means identical treatment under the law. If two adults commit the same crime, their gender should be irrelevant. Full stop. Others, however, argue equality should not be confused with equity. Equity means accounting for different lived experiences and act accordingly. If women statistically experience more trauma, then justice must reflect that. But here is the problem. Once we shift from assessing people as individuals to making assumptions based on the group they belong to, we move into much thinner ice. The risk is no longer just oversimplification, it is stereotyping. So let's see individual assessment versus group assessment. An individual assessment asks, who is this person? What are their circumstances? What factors are relevant in this specific case? It recognizes the two people who share the same gender, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background may nevertheless have completely different life stories, level of support, resilience, responsibility, or opportunity. While group-based reasoning works differently. It begins with patterns. For example, on average, members of this group experience X disadvantage. That can be useful for identifying broad social trends. But problems arise when those averages start to shape expectation about any one individual. What is statistically common becomes implicitly assumed. That's the danger. For example, if data shows that women on average earn less than men, it may be valid to examine structural causes of pay disparity. But it would be stereotyping to assume that a particular woman standing before a court is financially dependent or economically vulnerable without examining her actual circumstances. Similarly, if researchers shows that men are statistically more likely to commit certain violent offences, it would be unjust to treat every male defendant as inherently more dangerous simply because of his gender. In each case, the shift happens subtly. We move from this group often faces these challenges to this person probably fit that pattern. The individual becomes secondary to the category. Importantly, stereotypes are not always negative in tone. They can appear protective or sympathetic. Consistently framing women as vulnerable, for instance, may be intended to recognize historical disadvantage. But if that framing becomes automatic, it risks portraying women as inherently fragile, dependent, or less accountable for their actions. In the same way, portraying men as inherently strong or resilient can obscure men's vulnerability in areas like mental health or victimization. There is also a practical consequence. Policies built on group assumptions can create rigid systems. Decision makers may feel guided or even, I dare say, compelled to treat members of a certain group in predictable ways, despite the individual circumstances. That can reduce flexibility and discourage genuine inquiry into individual facts, which is what we are already seeing in sexual offences investigations. None of this means that group level data is irrelevant. Broad patterns are essential for identifying systemic problems. Without aggregated data, many forms of inequality would remain invisible. But there is a crucial distinction between using statistics to understand society and using them to define the person in front of a court. The moment group identity replaces individual assessment as the starting point for decision making, the risks of stereotyping rises. And even when those stereotypes are well intentioned, they can narrow rather than expand our understanding of human complexity. Also, if policy repeatedly frames women as vulnerable or traumatized, does that reinforce strength or fragility? Does it empower or does it subtly imply incapacity? You cannot simultaneously argue without creating tension that women are fully equal agents but structurally diminished actors. And here is the part people rarely discuss. Narratives don't stay confined to prisons. If public discourse repeatedly portrayed women as emotionally burdened, mentally fragile, shaped heavily by abuse, in need of protective intervention, does that influence how institutions perceive women in leadership, high-risk professions, child custody disputes, executive roles? So here is the question that might make you uncomfortable. Is gender-responsive criminal justice policy a necessary correction, or is it a departure from equal justice under the law? Should we A, move toward a fully individualized approach where decisions are made without relying on gender-based categories at all? B, maintain gender-specific policies as a matter of practical realism, but broaden the framework so that it explicitly includes men where relevant. C, step back more fundamentally and reconsider how we define and balance agency, vulnerability, and responsibility, but across the board. I am not here to give you an answer. I'm here to challenge the assumption that this issue is simple. And just to complete the picture, it helps remember where the idea of gender specific, later called gender responsive justice, came from. It was developed in the 80s and 90s, arriving in the UK a bit later, during a time when women's lives looked quite different from today. Fewer women were in the workforce, financial independence was less common, open discrimination and structural barriers were more visible and widely accepted. Laws and institutions were only beginning to recognize that women faced systemic disadvantages. But since then, a great deal has changed. Over the past 40 years, women's access to education has expanded dramatically. In many places, women now graduate from university at a higher rate than men. Careers opportunities have widened. Financial independence has become more common. And women are far more present in leadership roles in businesses, politics, academia, and public life. Expectations about women's roles at home and at work have shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible a few decades ago. In many respects, some say it has been a social revolution. Given these changes, it is reasonable to ask whether policies designed for the world of the late 20th century still fit the world we live in today. If gender responsive justice was built to address the disadvantages women faced in the 80s and 90s, should we revisit its assumptions? Do the same problem exist in the same way? Or do policy need to evolve as society evolves? However, at the same time, others argue that we should be careful not to assume the work is done. Yes, they say women have made enormous gains, but gender gaps still exist in areas like pay, senior leadership position, caregiving responsibilities, and exposure to certain forms of violence, and that the progress made so far is more akin to an evolution rather than a revolution. Some researchers have suggested that if progress continues, say, at the pace seen since the 60s, it could take another 70 or 80 years to reach full equality. And there is debate about whether progress, in fact, has slowed or reached a plateau in recent years, which raises concerns about whether we can even talk about evolution. But that also leads to another deeper question. If we continue to frame women primarily as vulnerable or disadvantaged, does that risk overlooking how much has changed? Could constantly emphasizing victimhood unintentionally undermine the reality of women's growing independence, strength, and leadership? Is there a tension between recognizing ongoing inequality and recognizing genuine progress? One argument is that instead of organizing policy primarily around gender, we might focus more directly on the drivers of offending. In other words, rather than asking, is this a women's justice issue? Or is this a men's justice issue? We might ask, what problem is actually leading this person to offend? For example, if substance abuse is a major contributor to reoffending, then policy could prioritize high-quality drug and alcohol treatment for anyone who needs it. Similarly, if untreated mental health conditions are driving criminal behavior, then access to psychological assessment and care could become central regardless of gender. If trauma history is a key factor, trauma-informed intervention could be provided, but to all affected individuals. This kind of issue-based approach, rather than gender-based approach, has several potential advantages. First, it reduces the risk of stereotyping. It does not assume that a woman necessarily has certain needs or that a man necessarily lacks them. Instead, it looks at the person in front of the system and identifies their specific criminogenic factors. Second, it may be more precise. If the goal is to reduce reoffending, then targeting the actual cause of crime, addiction, impulsivity, trauma, peer influence, poverty, may be more effective than using gender as a proxy. Third, it can promote fairness. Two people struggling with the same underlying problem would have access to the same support, regardless of whether they are male or female. However, supporters of gender-responsive models would respond that gender can shape how these root causes are experienced. For instance, pattern of victimization, caregiving responsibilities, or social expectations may influence pathways into crime differently for men and women. From that perspective, ignoring gender entirely could risk overlooking meaningful contextual differences. However, if the central aim is to reduce reoffending and support rehabilitation, focusing on identifiable evidence-based causes of crimes offer a strong practical foundation. Then the challenge lies in ensuring that in doing so, we neither stereotype nor overlook genuine differences where they matter. What I'm trying to say is that these are not easy questions, but they are important to ask. If we want policies to reflect today's realities and not just yesterday, then open and honest discussion is essential. This is bigger than ideology. It's about what equality actually means. So, do you believe justice policy should be blind to gender? Or do you believe gender-responsive policy is necessary for fairness? Let me know in the comments below. And remember to keep comments reasonable and respectful. That is it for today. I hope you have found this discussion interesting. And if so, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to help us in our mission to humanize the criminal justice system so that it heals society. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.